Good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this session today with the Red Arrows, looking back to their visit to Canada a year ago, which for us here in the UK and Canada Network was just an amazing experience. My name is Nicole Davison. I'm the British Consul General based here in Vancouver, and I had the pleasure of hosting the Red Arrows on the last stop of their Canadian tour last year. I'm joined today by Squadron Leader Martin Pert, who's also known as Red 1, and Squadron Leader Adam Collins, also known as Red 2. I'll introduce both more fully in a moment, but first of all, I'd just like to set the scene a little bit. So as I mentioned, we're now celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Red Arrows, taken to the sky above Vancouver, and that was the last stop of their 4-part Canadian tour. The tour was a huge success thanks to the efforts of all of our local partners and the general public who cheered us on by coming out in person, through social media, and of course a massive, massive thanks to the Red Arrows who came and made this such a special year for us. This webinar is a chance for us all to relive that experience and thank everyone who helped to make it so incredibly successful. And I'd particularly like to thank our sponsors for today's webinar, Marshall Aerospace and Defence Group. So now I'd like to introduce the special guests that I'm joined with. So I mentioned Squadron Leader Martin Pert, who joins me from the UK, as does Squadron Leader Adam Collins. Nice to see you both again. Can't believe it's a year already. Martin, just by way of introduction, is the Red Arrows team leader and is responsible for all aspects of the aerobatic display and for leading the team itself. Joined the Royal Air Force 2 decades ago. He's previously part of the Red Arrows team between 2012 and 2014 and has been team leader since 2018. And Squadron Leader Adam Collins, also known as Red 10, his duties include coordination of all practices and displays. He's the team's lead safety officer on the ground and is also the person that you hear providing commentary for the team's display. And I know from our reception last year, Adam, that you had us in the palm of your hand as you were doing those announcements. And he also has the job of flying the photographer who accompanies the team to take iconic shots. Joined the RAF in 1998, and this is his 3rd year with the Red Arrows. Lovely to see you both again. As I say, can't believe it's a year ago. So how are you both? How has this year been for you? It's obviously very different.
It has been an incredibly different year, and it's so difficult to imagine that it was 12 months ago that we were with you over in Vancouver, and it just seems to have flashed by, but clearly a lot's changed in those 12 months, and it's really nice for us just to be able to join you this evening, as it is over here, just to reminisce actually and look back upon what was just a great 2019 for us, and topping that off with our tour over to Canada. This year has been particularly difficult, as it has for absolutely everyone. So our public shows have been curtailed almost entirely. We've displayed just 3 times this year, compared to a normal year where we would display about 80 or so displays. So it's a great opportunity for us to be able to reflect and join you and talk about 2019 and last year's activities.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, it's, as I say, hard to believe it's a year already. What we're going to do is we'll have sort of 45 minutes just kind of chatting about last year's tour and some of the highlights and some of the logistic complexities that go into making a tour such a success as well. And then we will also, for anyone online, whichever way you're following us, feel free to send us your comments, your thoughts, what were your favourite parts of the tour, any questions you'd like us to think about, and we can have more general chat in the second half of this. So, I mean, first of all, if we kind of start at the very beginning, arranging a tour like this is obviously a massive, massive logistical challenge. And I'm aware that in addition to the 4 cities in Canada, you had a very extensive US element as well. So, many, many stops over many, many weeks. Can you just talk me through, Perty, from your perspective as team leader, how far in advance does the planning start and what kind of things go into consideration as to whether a tour is actually feasible?
Yeah, absolutely, Nicole. I mean, a tour of this size is almost, for the Red Arrows history, is probably one of the largest that we've embarked upon, certainly to the American continent. So it took, I think, probably about 18 months of pure planning to get us to even the stage of leaving the UK shores. When it hit the floor here at the Red Arrows, it was probably about 12 months in advance. And most of that was considered in 2 sections. The first bit was to get us across the Atlantic and back again safely and appropriately. And then the other half was the actual planning of the destinations that we were going to be at. The task of getting across the Atlantic was probably one that we as the pilots spent the majority of our time on, because actually once we were in country or in continent, actually the acts and the displays and the fly past were almost normal business for us. whereas actually crossing the Atlantic was a big challenge that most of us haven't undertaken in an aircraft of the size and the scale of our plans. So yeah, it was about 12 months of really hard graft planning, looking at routes, looking at fuel plans, looking at the airfields that we could come into to get ourselves just across the Atlantic to even be able to start the tour. And as for the actual destinations, that was probably more Adam's bag. So I'll let him talk to kind of the destinations once we were in country.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the big things with putting on an aerobatic display is we have to meet whichever the local regulations are. So in the UK, we're very used to our regulations here, but flying in Canada and flying in the US, we now have to consider that before we start developing the show for the 2019 season in the UK, so that we don't have to change it too much when we get over there. So actually, a lot of my time was spent liaising with the FAA for the US and then with the Canadian military, who were going to essentially sanction our display routine and check that it was conforming to the rules over there, making sure that it was safe to put that on in front of the public. And then for me to have a look at the sites we were going to display at across the whole tour. So we did about 20 aerobatic displays in total and about 20 major flypasts. So each of those needed the site looking into, the regulations checking, and then all the liaison with the air bosses and the event organizer to make sure that we were going to deliver what is an iconic Red Arrow show, but also one that conforms to the safety regulations, which are obviously very important.
And in terms of that process, Adam, then, I mean, liaising on the very different requirements that you have in every country that you go to, and thinking particularly about Canada, how much is there sort of an art of compromise in this and having to adapt what you do to suit local standards?
That's exactly what we did. So what we try to do is not change our display, well, we change it as little as possible between the sites that we display at in the UK. So throughout the season, the way we train is repetition. We're building up from the basic display with 3 aircraft to begin with until we get up to the 9 ship. And then when we fly that routine, we want it to be the same every time so that the pilots are familiar with it. There's no big changes or distractions that might lead ultimately to mistakes. So what we needed to do was consider that right at the start of the season in the UK before we started our domestic flying here, and make sure that any changes or maneuvers we had in the show were going to be compliant with the Canadian regulations and with the US regulations. And that's really where my liaison started back in December of the previous year, talking to the authorities, talking to the people that were going to essentially rubber stamp our display to be safe to continue with once we crossed the pond. And then once we had that established, we knew that other than a couple of minor tweaks, it was going to be exactly the same as we'd flown in the UK.
Yeah, yeah. No,
I mean, and if I can just add as well, you know, what was great for us in the planning stage is that we reached out to some of our partners across in Canada. So the Royal Canadian Air Force, especially the Snowbirds, and Colonel Daryl Shayak as well, who from the Royal Canadian Air Force, to name check. You know, early on in our planning stage, and sort of reached out and said, look, we'd love if you're able to help us in any stretch. And they absolutely, you know, they dug out blind for us. And we probably wouldn't have succeeded with this tour without people like Daryl Shayak. There was Blake McNaughton from the Snowbirds, and just the whole sort of airshow fraternity. And it was a really comforting way, because it's a small world in Europe, the airshow community. But it's just a smaller world, even when crossing the pond. And that kind of gave us some sense of how well we were going to be welcomed into the fold. We're complete strangers across the continent. And yet, you know, we hadn't been across for 11 years. And we were, you know, open arms. And that just gave us a really warm feeling, even before we'd left the UK.
And even structuring the timing of the tour and which cities we were going to hit, which were the priorities for the Great campaign and for engagement on the ground, but also the shows. We're really using those shows as our timetable to move around the continent. So we had ideas when we knew that we were coming on the timeline. We had ideas of which shows we definitely wanted to go to. So Toronto, for example. But then we were working back from that. We knew we wanted to be in the Ottawa area. The Gatineau show, the timing didn't quite work for us. So people like John Bennett were flexible enough to actually arrange an additional show, bring in some other acts as well, so it wasn't just us displaying, but that kind of flexibility and the welcoming nature and really the great reception we got from the public and from the authorities and the show organisers over there was remarkable, to be honest. Now,
obviously, I'd completely endorse that, and from our experiences here, I mean, we couldn't have done anything like this had it not been for all the assistance that we got from local partners who just really pulled it out of the bag for us on every stop. I mean, in terms of I mean, I want to talk about sort of the various stops that you made and what some of your impressions were, sort of some of the events that we worked on together there. But just overall then, in terms of a visit to a country like Canada, what do you see as being your principal aims? What is it about that you can bring in terms of promoting the UK to an air show like that, or a tour across Canada?
Clearly, our mission is just to promote British prosperity and just to show the innovation that we as a team bring to a new country that whilst the team haven't been across in Canada for 11 years, hopefully there is some familiarity in that with the airshow acts that they're already used to. I think what we also bring is not just the airshow and not just the display in the air, but just engagement on the ground, which is something that we've definitely been building upon year after year over here in the UK. And we just wanted to expand upon science, technology, engineering and maths, those key buzzwords. STEM is just a really excellent way of getting into the mindset of youth. And it doesn't really matter where they're from. It doesn't matter which country they're from. If we can engender some thought process about getting involved in those industries, whilst softly closing the links between the two countries, and clearly, both the friendships that we have in the aviation sector, but broader industry as well, and just being the talisman, flying that red, white and blue over their heads just to make them think, what is it that the UK and Britain has to offer? Then that was our aim, and it didn't really go much further than that, but actually it gave us a really broad spectrum of things that we could build upon whilst we were in country.
I mentioned that we've done 20 major displays, 20 high-profile flypasts, and clearly when we're planning a tour like this, we're always looking at where we'd be able to get the great shot of that flypast. So there's some really iconic places in Canada that we flew over. But that ground engagement, the 20 shows, the 20 flypasts, for those 40 events, we had over 120 ground engagements, and that was with everybody from ambassadors down to school children, really promoting STEM. In all, I think we reached over 5,000 students in person with those ground events. And it's not just those of us in the red suits as well, it's the whole team. So we took nearly 100 people across the pond with us. The majority of those in the blue suits, our support team, and that's everybody from engineers through to logistics specialists, administrators, and everything in between. And they're all equally qualified to talk with authority on teamwork, on STEM, and they go out and they do good work in those engagements as well as those of us in the red suit. So it's been a real team effort throughout, and that STEM focus and that ground engagement actually arguably sometimes is more influential and more effective than the flying.
I mean, certainly the STEM element is just a huge contribution that engagement like yours can make to the whole conversation. And I remember one of my favourite moments, I think, was in Halifax when we had the young school children who were about 5, 6, 7, 8 or so come along, and just to see their faces when they were looking at the aircraft and everything. And hopefully for some of them, one day they'll turn around and say, I became a pilot because of that day. Thinking about Halifax then, so I was lucky enough to get over to Halifax and was there for your first arrival. You've had this big logistical challenge of getting across the Atlantic. You finally make it to Halifax. What were your first impressions of your first events? I mean, for example, your fly over there and just seeing the crowds that came out on that wonderfully sunny day. What does that actually feel like to know that you've made it and this is where it all starts?
I think for us, that was the real first moment where we realized what we'd embarked upon and actually made the whole thing feel, completely tangible. It was real. It was, this is it. We've made it across what was actually probably one of the bigger logistical challenges for us as the pilots, the bit that had really focused our minds. Now we could really set upon the task in hand. And what it also did is it made us realize that we were going to be welcomed and that we were going to be able to display to an appreciative audience. We had no idea whether there was going to be 5 people turn up, 5,000, or, as it turned out, more so, tens of thousands of people down there on the dock. And I think that just instantly set the scene. We arrived, bang on the second at Halifax Airport, which was more by luck than any judgment, I'll be perfectly honest, as the team leader. But there we were, exactly the time we'd been asked to arrive. Thank you to, NAV Canada and the air traffic authorities for allowing us to do that. And that really set the scene for us for what was a spectacular opening weekend. You know, we managed to sample all of the delights of Halifax. You know, we had a great time in Nova Scotia, and what a, you know, just a great welcome, and it just made it the stamp. This is it. We're, you know, this is real.
Yeah.
And for us, Halifax was a busy period. When we arrived on the first day, beautiful sunshine as we landed, taxied into the handling agent area, and the hangar was already set up for the first of the Great Campaign events. So there were British industries there, local producers. So we were sampling food and drink and so on whilst we were there. And then really starting that trade engagement right from the minute we arrived. And actually that first fly past, or enhanced fly past as we call it, over Halifax, that was the culmination of a pretty important day. It was that morning that we'd had our validation with not just Daryl from the Canadian Forces, but with the FAA. So the US authorities had come across to Canada and validated our display that morning such that we could then carry on to Chicago and beyond. So we rolled from that event in the morning, having been given the approval, to then bringing our enhanced fly past over Halifax with the crowds that had turned up. And for me, being down there on the ground, really, I got to absorb that atmosphere before anyone else, so that when the rest of the guys arrived, you could see the looks on their faces as they were walking in. There was a really warm reception there. And as Perty said, it's a great way to actually go, okay, the ball is now rolling, we're away.
Yeah, at that point it becomes sort of an unstoppable machine, doesn't it? And you're just in it and have to carry on. I mean, Halifax was, as I say, an amazing beginning, and I felt so lucky to be there. From there, you then want to, in terms of Canadian cities, your next engagement in Canada was Ottawa, obviously the capital, and that included a fly past with 2 Spitfires. And I think you also met 97-year-old Ernie Allen, who has flown for Spitfires in the Second World War. What does it mean to you to kind of connect with the past in that way and meet, you know, some of these pilots who've gone before you? What does that mean for you on a sort of personal level? Perhaps, Perty, I can put that to you first.
Sure, of course. Yeah, I mean, Adam and I are both very lucky that we've been in the military for nigh on 20 years. And throughout our time, we've met a number of veterans from all sorts of eras. But actually, as time has pressed on, there are fewer and fewer veterans from the Second World War. And to actually meet, you know, a Spitfire veteran, someone who flew these machines, of which there were a number at Gatineau at the time, either in the hangar or, as you've already alluded to, flying with us. It's just a real tangible link to the history, and not just our history as the Royal Air Force, you know, the Royal Canadian Air Force. You know, it was a great way just to kind of shake hands. And there's a beautiful picture of the team just crowded around this 97-year-old gentleman, absolutely enraptured by his stories. And when you look him in the eye, although, you know, he's got, you know, it's a 97-year-old man you're looking at. When you look him in the whites of the eyes, there's a 21-year-old Spitfire pilot who's telling you almost exactly the same stories that a lot of our crews have been through, be it on their operational frontline squadrons, you know, and even our engineers getting to engage with someone like that, to actually ask them about what's it like to fly these machines. We're getting as much from this as hopefully the people that we're setting out to visit. And I think that was it was a key moment for us as well.
One of our main roles, and what we try and do through the ground engagement and the flying, is to inspire people, not just the next generation, but inspire anyone who has a dream, to try and encourage them to follow that. But actually, there's a lot of people that we meet, not just veterans, not just people who are very well known, but people that you wouldn't expect, that are a real inspiration to us as well. And that meeting was definitely one of those occasions.
I mean, I think there's such a neat synergy as well when you meet these veterans and people who've gone before you, and then part of what you do is obviously inspire the next generation as well. There's just such a very neat synergy to that as well. And I mean, certainly those for me are real goosebump moments when we get to meet people like that. Adam, I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that you also are very closely involved in is the photography aspect as well. Ottawa, of course, is very iconic. You have the legislature and Parliament. And what are the kind of things that you take into account when thinking about the iconic imagery that comes out of the flyovers that you do? Well,
firstly, I quite often have the best seat in the house, to be honest. So it's great being in the 9 ship and flying the formation. But when we're photo chasing, I'm in that position where I ultimately want to get the best view to make the photos look as good as we can. But it's a real team effort between me and the photographer that's flying in my back seat, and it's generally the same photographer I'm flying with each time. So we'll have a chat beforehand. We'll have a look at the route, have a look at what we're going over, look at imagery of the buildings and what really we want to try and get from the picture. We'll take the sun angle into account and so on. But then places like Ottawa, we've got the added complication of airspace. We did various high-profile flypasts with different complexities of airspace, different limitations on how high I can go compared with the rest of the formation. But we'll come up with a plan of the image we're trying to capture. I'll try and put the aircraft in exactly that position at the right time for the photographer to do their business. And then, all being well, we get the image that we're after. Now, sometimes inevitably there's a little bit of luck in there. So we might find that there's an amazing shadow that just happens to be there and it wasn't planned, but we'll take those every time. But we do have a plan. We'll go out to get that image and then hopefully get some others that will accompany it. So real privilege for me, and really the highlight of the tour for me was being in that position to actually see the big picture, see those iconic sites, many of which are burnt into my memory forever.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And of course, I mean, Ottawa was the place in Canada where you first took part in an air show at Gatineau. What are your memories of that? How exciting was that to do actually your first sort of full air show here?
Oh, that was an incredible day, actually. Thankfully, the weather was just glorious when we were in Gatineau, and we taxied out, and it was a really rapturous sort of audience who'd rushed up to the fence line at the front. Now, a lot of the time when we're in the cockpit displaying, we kind of get no sense of how things are going on the ground, whether the crowd are even enjoying it or what's going on. But as we taxied out, Adam here sort of keyed the mic, and we speak to each other quite a lot during the display for various safety reasons. But he keyed the mic, and all we heard on the radio was just this almighty cheer from the crowd that were there in Gatineau. And I think
probably helped that you just got a Canadian flag out in the cockpit and held it up against the side.
I found a Canadian flag in my cockpit. It's sort of just randomly placed in there. So I took one with me, and I think just that set the scene for the whole display team. And what was so touching for us when we landed is that because our ground crew were right in front of the audience, so they were right sort of front and center doing their see-off and quite a choreographed display in itself. They were just grinning from ear to ear when we taxied back in after the display. And quite a lot of the time, you've got to remember, we go and do our displays, certainly here in the UK, we'll often take off from a home base, disappear for about an hour whilst we go over to a coastal site, come back again, and our engineers have got no real sort of idea of what we've been doing. Here, they were right there in the thick of it. And that audience in Gatineau was so appreciative, whooping, hollering, oohs and ahs, when the crosses were happening. And our engineers, I can't tell you the effect it had on them. They were just beaming from ear to ear, as I said. And we stepped out of that cockpit, and it was, that was such a glorious moment. And it was a gorgeous evening. We got time, to spend with a veteran. We got to go into the hangar. We got to look around the old warbirds. I mean, it couldn't have been the more perfect arrival display for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and they are so incredibly visual, and as you say, it just really takes the crowd along in such an exciting way. From Ottawa, you then went on to Toronto, where we had a number of very, very significant moments. That's where you flew with the Snowbirds. That's where you had Chris Hadfield join you. I mean, that is just a lot of sort of iconic momentary right there in terms of, particularly in Canadian terms. What was it like to be connected with the Snowbirds, who are basically, I guess, a sibling organisation to you, and have such a sort of similar ethos in what you do?
That's exactly right. People talk about rivalry between display teams around the world, but actually it's not rivalry. It's a real common respect and admiration for what each other do. Ultimately, we're all going out there to do a very similar thing, but we do it in slightly different ways. So being able to meet up with the Snowbirds, several of us had met them before during the planning stages, and then through the tour with them, and then subsequently. So real privilege, and to be able to fly with the Toronto skyline in the background, join up with the Snowbirds, and again, photo chasing that, a real highlight for me. Perfect backdrop on our practice day at the Canadian International Air Show, but having the Snowbirds there just was the icing on the cake, really. And it's a highlight for it.
I think for me, it was a total sensory overload. I think you've kind of already alluded to it. Toronto is a place I know reasonably well, having spent a bit of time there in my youth, and it was probably the one part of the tour I was really looking forward to the most. And just to have that backdrop of being able to fly, over the lake there with you know, just the backdrop of the business district and the CN Tower and just all of these, you know, out of Pearson, an international airport where they effectively gave us free reign of the airport with a very special passenger in my rear seat, flying in formation with the Snowbirds, who Adam's already said we'd made some really good friends with. You know, that for me was the highlight of the tour. There was just all four of those factors that just built in to make what in my career is going to be very difficult to top.
It was definitely a pinch yourself moment, looking out, just seeing a mass of red and white jets. I mean, there were 19 jets in total flying over the display area in Toronto. Once we'd finished the formation with the Snowbirds, they peeled off, went back to land at Pearson, and then we did our aerobatic practice for the day. Got some amazing imagery from that, which, again, those images will stay with me forever. But then being able to compare notes with the Snowbirds, talk to them afterwards, talk to them on the ground, and then even fly each other. So a few of the Snowbirds flew with us in our back seats, and then a couple of our pilots flew with the Snowbirds. So developed a real bond with them, and that wasn't the last time we saw them during the tour. So we would meet up a couple of times throughout the tour and spend some really good time with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Perty, you alluded to your special guest, Chris Hadfield. I mean, that's a pretty, as you say, pinch yourself moment to meet someone of that caliber. How does it sort of change your feeling about flying, knowing you've got someone like that in your back seat?
Yeah, absolutely does. I mean, we're in the job of trying to inspire the youth and inspire generations, and then along comes a spaceman. You know, he was the director of many space missions, and I think for all of us, we were completely overawed. He's also an ex RCAF Hornet pilot, F-18 pilot, and as soon as he sat in my back seat, it was like he was, you know, back in a normal fast jet cockpit as a senior fast jet operator that I've flown with, you know, a number of times. He picking up on the radio calls, picking up on the sort of formation communication banter that we have with each other. You know, he was right back in the moment, and it was just so special to be able to have the opportunity to spend time with any astronauts, you know, let alone an icon like Colonel Hadfield. So yeah, I mean, what an amazing entry for my flying logbook, and just a privileged day. And it was even more touching that it was his 60th birthday that day. And, you know, the fact that he wanted to come and fly with us on his birthday, when I'm sure he had all manner of things lined up, was, you know, again, just a sign of the man himself. And we spent a great almost 24 hours with him. And just
I can't think of a better 60th birthday present, so I'm just putting it out there for my my next significant birthday. I do have to ask this question, because we're going to move on to Vancouver shortly, and while you were in Vancouver, we took you to a Canucks game, but you also went to a Blue Jays game in Toronto. No pressure, which was the better of the two experiences? Just asking.
I'm going to put it out there and say that the hockey game was a little more action-packed. So it was a great experience going to the Blue Jays game, and Laurie and the team there arranged that for us. Chris Hadfield came along with us. So I think watching the Blue Jays eating birthday cake with Chris Hadfield is one of the more surreal experiences of my life. But I'm going to put it out there and say I think most people enjoyed the sport of hockey more, but the experience of being in the Blue Jays stadium and being up there with the team there was great.
What he said.
That was very diplomatic, actually. That was a good answer. Absolutely. So, I mean, from my perspective, we're kind of saving the best till last, because you finished off here in Vancouver, where I'm currently based. I mean, that did sort of bring your tour of Canada to a conclusion. And I mean, I know that you stay at the top of your game until the very last moment of your very last stop. But what was it like to kind of know that Vancouver was finishing out your Canadian tour?
I think it was probably the perfect finish for all of us. In some respects, I think there were only maybe 2 members of the team who'd been to Vancouver before. And yet, I think of all of us, it was the one place that we were really looking forward to on the visit, because we'd either not been there or heard so much about, you know, the West Coast of Canada. So it was fantastic to be able to come up the West Coast to the US. The flight into Vancouver itself was just beautiful, and just obviously the scenery sets that. And then we landed at the airport to, you know, a lovely reception there. But then I think the focus was about the task in hand. It's clearly quite a difficult place for us to display. It's quite a small area. There's lots of the seaplanes that they have down on the water there. The international airport is very close by. So I think we were looking forward to it. We managed to reflect on it. The actual heat of the moment, I think probably Adam got to enjoy the most down there on the ground with you guys. Whereas for us, it was very much about the task in hand and making sure that we had it. That said, it was an evening like no other. I'm sure Vancouver gets plenty of them, but gorgeous sort of late, low-lying sun. We went to do a fly past over some of the islands first, and just getting that view felt like we were incredibly privileged. Again, air traffic almost gave us free rein. You know, we went and did the fly past in Victoria, and then we came back up the route that the seaplanes generally take, and just seeing all of that from the air before then starting the display down there for all the people was great.
And again, the theme throughout our time in Canada was Daryl was present with us on this one, as was Naughty, and really their work that they did behind the scenes to enable that to happen meant that we had that free reign of the airspace, and we could put on 5 or 6 passes. Couldn't do the full display there because of the density of built up area and so on. And of course, we were actually down to 8 aircraft by that stage, which we may come on to in a little bit, but that didn't detract from it at all. In some ways, it just made it more unique. So yeah, a really memorable experience, and being able to talk to people on the rooftop as we were, where the function was going on, describe what was going on, and then talk to people afterwards. Everyone clearly really interested in the tour, really interested in what we were doing, and some great conversations about why we were there and what we'd achieved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, and just for people online, I mean, you know, this is there's so much complexity that goes into a tour like this, and you've alluded to the density of the harbour area, and just a sort of shout out to, for example, Harbour Air, who grounded their flights for, I think, for certainly over an hour, so that you could have the airspace, and just having to sort of like negotiate things like that is incredibly complex. Adam, you've just alluded to it, so we will come on to the slight curveball, well, not entirely unexpected curveball that you were thrown, but one of your pilots had to go home because his wife went into labour, and so you ended up flying with 8 rather than 9. I mean, things like that obviously do happen, or so how do you kind of absorb that into your sort of working progress, and how do you adapt for circumstances like that?
Yeah, we very much have a contingency plan for each of the pilots. So we're able to fly, obviously at 9 ship display as our norm. We can fly when any of the other pilots other than myself are unable to fly for, be it illness, maybe aircraft technical issue, or on this case, you know, very close personal matter. And Red 8 at the time, sorry, he was Red 2 at the time, Damo, he's subsequently become Red 8. It was the birth of his first daughter. Now, we're a military outfit. There were a few questions asked of, well, should he not just be staying? You know, you're a military outfit. Absolutely not. The appropriate thing was, we're at an international airport. We can get him home quickly. And thankfully, with his wife going into labour, he managed to make his first daughter's birth by about half an hour, which, you know, in itself is a magical moment, which he'll never be able to get back. So absolutely the appropriate thing to do. Our contingency fallout is that we do train. We train as an 8 ship when we have what we call a loser plot, when somebody drops out. And that was absolutely appropriate to do so for that display. And actually, when we spoke to people on the ground, and they did, the ones who noticed, because obviously some people didn't notice, but about the ones who did notice, asking, you know, where was the 9th aircraft? When we actually told them the story, it was actually a bit more human. It made things a bit more personable, and made, you know, people realise that we do care about our people, which was a nice touch, and just a great way for us to kind of cap off our Canadian elements of the tour.
Yeah,
and of course, we're all from an operational background. One of the prerequisites of joining the team is that you've flown fighters on the front line, and you have a minimum amount of experience. And of course, when we're on operational units and we're away on operations, then we wouldn't have the liberty of being able to send somebody home necessarily for an occasion like this. But the role that we're doing is very specific. We're not at war when we're doing it. So being able to send people home and actually look after our people for us is just as important as being able to fly the flag for Great Britain. And as we've said, it doesn't detract from the message we're putting out there. And Damo was actually able to rejoin us about a week later and finish off the tour in the 9th jet. So it was a good news story. The fact he made it back with 30 minutes to spare was, I think, good planning on our part.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you make a good point about, the questions asked about military outfit, but I think also it's a really good example of the importance of the personal versus the work and the work-life balance, and how you do try and accommodate that as well. So, for us, I don't think anybody felt any the less for not having the 9th jet. In fact, I don't think actually, it's quite surprising how quite a few people didn't actually notice that there wasn't a 9th jet. So you obviously got compensated very well for it.
Good, I'm glad to hear.
We're coming sort of towards the end of the first part, and then we'll have a brief intermission. And so absolutely no agenda and no subtext on this at all, but you had a lot of different impressions during your whole tour. If you could both pick out one standout, your most exciting or goosebump moment of your whole Canadian tour, what would that be?
I'll go first on that one. I think the whole experience in Toronto, from the arrival over the Niagara Falls, especially from my position as photo chasing, from 20 miles out, even down at a couple of thousand feet, you could see the water vapor and the mist coming up. So the feeling of approaching Niagara, doing the photos there, running into Toronto, and then the whole experience in Toronto of flying that show with the snowbirds, with Chris Hadfield, with the welcome that we had there, and the show itself, which was an amazing few days there. Really, that's the highlight for me.
Well, Adam stole my thunder, because Toronto definitely did have a very personal touch, and I think, was the favourite display location, absolutely. Actually, when I reflect upon it, the bit that touched me the most was probably when we left Canadian airspace, or when we were just leaving to go up to Goose Bay up in Labrador to start our journey home. And we were actually intercepted by 2 CF-18s from Bagotville, where we'd stopped for a refuel. And just for that personal touch, fighter pilots to fighter pilots that came alongside, gave us a wing waggle, peeled off, and sent us on our way. It made it feel like that was a job well done. And I think actually, to cap it off, we as pilots probably couldn't have asked for a better moment over the beautiful lakes up there. So whilst I would say Toronto, I think just that closing flight for me was a real nice way to seal it. Yeah, absolutely. And there's absolutely no doubt it was absolutely 100% is a job well done. I mean, from every aspect, from us here on the ground as well. So a huge thank you. That brings us to the end of part 1. We are going to have a brief intermission now, in which we're going to have an exclusive look at our new feature film behind the scenes of the Red Arrows tour. But what I would encourage people online, in whatever format you're watching, do post questions. We've got Perty and Adam with us for about another 45 minutes or so, and happy to take any questions that you might want to raise. So we will have a brief intermission and be back in about 5 minutes or so. Okay. Our team was busy preparing for the final Red Arrows event in Vancouver, the last Canadian stop of their North American tour. In downtown Vancouver, we were setting up to host an all-day public event with partners and colleagues, which included everything from activities and giveaways to meeting the Red Arrows themselves. It was a special day in Vancouver, complete with many iconic landmarks lighting up red, white and blue to welcome the Red Arrows to the city.
That evening, our events culminated in the Red Arrow's enhanced flypast over the Vancouver Harbour, concluding the Canadian leg of the tour. And what an incredible tour it was. Here's a look back at the Red Arrow's time in Canada and a behind-the-scenes view of the tour.
Goodness, can't believe it's been a year already. It's been great to sit in the office and think back upon some of the great memories of our tour across to Canada last year. From the moment that we entered Canadian airspace and got that friendly hello from Gander Control, all the way down to the arrival at Halifax, bang on time, and the warm reception that we got down there. We then moved on. Clearly we did the flypast down in the Halifax harbour, but getting to Ottawa and the flypast over Parliament Hill, you know, another nation's capital, and being granted that airspace, just for me as a pilot, was just such a dream. And then clearly the display in Gatineau later on that week in glorious conditions. We then clearly moved to Toronto for the Labour Day weekend, and what a time that was, flying with the Snowbirds with Colonel Chris Hadfield in the back over Lake Ontario, and those views of Toronto, just absolutely incredible. Probably only bettered then by moving across to the West Coast, and finally my chance to see Vancouver, a place I've never been able to visit but have always wanted to, and doing our enhanced flypast down on the waterfront with all those thousands of people watching. So it's so difficult to believe that it's almost over a year now. We've still got such wonderful pictures and wonderful memories of it, and even leaving Canadian airspace and being greeted out of the airspace by F-18s from NORAD just absolutely topped it, the icing on the cake.
Last year's North American tour was the largest ever. It was the first time the Red Arrows had crossed over Canada from coast to coast with 4 Canadian stops. For our UK and Canada team, the tour began just as we launched our 55 Parallels campaign, which featured in many of our events along the way and celebrated the special UK and Canada connections between our people, our shared values and our quest for innovation. The Red Arrows tour in Canada was massive. We had flypaths over 5 Canadian cities, that's Halifax, Ottawa, Niagara Falls, Victoria and Vancouver. We ran 2 separate air shows in Gatineau and Toronto with a total of 4 displays and 1 historic flypast with Commander Chris Hadfield and the Royal Canadian Air Force Snowbirds. And we organised 30 ground engagements, including 9 STEM sessions with students, 4 days of waterfront events, 3 documentary screenings and 1 special morning event on the Hill.
So it's been 12 months since we were in Canada, and I look back on our time over there with really fond memories. One of the unique aspects of my job is that I get to see the display from the ground and see the reaction of the crowd whilst I'm commentating and supervising, as well as watching the aircraft fly. So seeing the warm welcome, the warm reaction from those first crowds in Gatineau all the way through to our enhanced flypast in Vancouver was a real privilege for me, and I really got to gauge how welcoming and how much the Canadian public really enjoyed our flying. The other aspect that is a great privilege for me is photo chasing. Now, there were several flypasts we did in Canada which are real standouts in my memory, particularly flying over Niagara, flying over the falls on the way into Toronto. And then for me, really the highlight for photo chasing was our practice day in Toronto. Not only were we flying with Chris Hadfield in the back seat of Red 1, but we got to join up with the Canadian Forces Snowbirds, another team very well respected around the world, lots of mutual respect between the 2 teams, and we were able to conduct mixed formation flypast and some manoeuvring in different shapes on the Toronto waterfront. The photographer in my backseat managed to capture some amazing images, and we then followed that up with photo chasing our aerobatic practice, which for me, with the Toronto skyline in the background, the very picturesque setting on the waterfront, was a real highlight of the whole tour.
So delivering the Red Arrows tour in Canada was a massive undertaking, and it wouldn't have been possible without the collaboration of the Red Arrows themselves, our Canadian partners, and all of the UK and Canada team. It was a true team effort to pull it all off, from setting up waterfront events and public displays to all of the logistical and detailed support that happens behind the scenes, and the UK-Canada partnership that made it all possible in the first place. From working with air shows to low flying above cities and all of the events in between, it was yet another example of the UK-Canada partnership that underlines so much of what we do together.
And of course, none of this would have been possible or meaningful if it wasn't for the engagement of Canadians across the country. From the countless partnerships that made it possible to the thousands of Canadians who came out to events to meet the Red Arrows and to watch them paint the skies red, white and blue, we thank you.
Right. Here we go. Can you get my chat up? Oops. Hi, so welcome back to part 2, which is where the opportunity where you get to ask questions of our dear friends Perty and Adam. I hope you enjoyed the movie. That was a brief look at behind the scenes, and hopefully gave everyone a taste of just what went into making the tour such a success. So I'm going to, excuse me while I just bring up my chat, so they've got a big thumb hanging over the screen there. But I've got a couple of questions that are coming on the chat already for you. Adam, perhaps this one for you. So starting off with a question from Second Lieutenant Gordon Tate, who says, I was deeply privileged to be on the ground on Parliament Hill as you performed a flypast of the Guard Mount. It was a breathtaking experience, particularly for a junior Air Force officer. Were you aware that we had made changes to the parade in order to hold the present arms to coordinate with your arrival? It then goes on to say, your precision timing and formation complemented our drill and pride in a truly epic moment. So thank you, Gordon. Really nice compliments from you there. But there's basically a question of how much are you aware of things that have been changed around you to kind of adapt to what it is you're doing?
So really, the events that are going on the ground and our flypast go hand in hand. So we're very much aware of what's going on the ground. We work to split-second timing. We have pretty antiquated equipment in our aircraft, so half the time we're just working on a stopwatch. But we are very aware of what's going on. The timings that we're working to are dictated by what's going on the ground, and to be honest. So things like taking the salute, the end of a national anthem, for example, or a specific part of a parade is what our flypast will be geared around. So we're very much aware of that. And I'm glad the timing worked out well, and I'm glad you enjoyed seeing the aircraft come over.
Great, thank you. Perty, this one I think is probably for you. It's a question from Ron Eckersley, who asks, he says, on your transit from Greenland to Goose Bay, what height were you at and what was your impression of what was below you?
That's a great question. So from Greenland to Goose Bay was probably the longest leg of all of the transatlantic crossings that we did. And for that reason, the little jets that we fly, which are only designed as training aircraft, are more efficient up at very high levels. So we were actually up at about 33,000 feet, which is pretty high. And we didn't really get to see an awful lot on the way across, but on the way back, so from Goose Bay across to Greenland on the way home, the weather was much better. And actually from that height, you get a really good view of what's happening. We encountered some weather difficulties. So the weather at the airfield we were meant to be landing at in Greenland was not great on the way home. So actually we got to see all of those views in total twice, because four times, because we went all the across to Greenland and sort of see the ice cap over there, and the real difference, even just split by what is only really 700 miles or so.
Absolutely. And in fact, actually, you alluded to this earlier, Martin, which you said that the Atlantic leg was perhaps one of the most logistically difficult that you've done. Can you just talk us through the stops that you did to get from your home base to Canada, and sort of what is the maximum length of time you could take to do each one of those?
Of course, yeah, no problem at all. So we're based right in the middle, right in the heart of the United Kingdom, sort of in the Midlands area. And the range or the endurance of this aircraft is about 2 hours, which gets us around about 850 nautical miles, which let's call it, 900 miles for 900 real miles. So from here, we went up to the north of Scotland, an RAF base called Lossiemouth for a refuel. We then went from Lossiemouth across to Iceland. So the airport in Reykjavik for a refuel over there, Keflavik. And then that's the western side of Iceland. Then from Iceland, it was across to Greenland, and we picked a tiny little airfield, a place called Narsarsuaq in Greenland, which is a tiny little 6,000 foot long runway, not very long at all really for an aircraft that we fly, but which is used lots for people who cross the pond in smaller aircraft like Cessnas and whatnot. And I think that was the bit that was really the challenge for us, because with about 40 minutes to go until landing, if we couldn't get into that airfield, we had no other options, which is some sort of flying that none of us have ever done in the military. We always have an alternative airport that we can go and land at should there be any problems with that airfield. So that was the real challenge. And then from that airfield, Narsarsuaq, we then did it one leg across to Goose Bay in Labrador. So from start to sort of arriving in Canada, it was only 48 hours. It was 4 sorties in total. But then we had obviously to get from Labrador down to Halifax, which was another sortie in itself. So, amazing views. It's the sort of flying that we as pilots relish, because it is still a real adventure for us for those reasons I've already spoken to. And because we're right on the fuel endurance and range of the aircraft that we're flying, that's what made it such a logistical challenge for us all.
When you're flying on the front, flying on the front line, or flying, for example, Hornets, like in Canada, you've got 2 engines and you've got the capability to air-to-air refuel. So we've all flown across the Atlantic before on frontline aircraft, some with 1 engine, some with 2, but you've normally got the ability to take fuel on the way, which gives you, if not the ability to get over in one flight, the ability to have options when you're landing there. So for us in a training aircraft that can't air-to-air refuel, only has 1 engine, very limited avionics, then it harks back to the early days of airline flying, really flying those northern routes, landing on a downhill runway that's quite short for us, with icebergs floating past the end of it in Greenland. So there are a few photos that we all love of us there in our immersion suits, our thermal layers and everything, having landed in Greenland with some massive relieved smiles on our faces, having got the jets in there. So it was, to be honest, a real adventure just getting there, before then the tour properly unfolding from there.
I can't imagine how nerve-wracking it must be to do something with no plan B as well. I mean, that just must get all your adrenaline pumping. We've got some other questions coming in on Facebook. So just to remind everyone, we're on Facebook and we are on Zoom. So if you want to submit any questions through either of those mediums, then please go ahead. So we've got a question here from Keith Godwin, who's asking it on behalf of Lewis, who's 7. And so Lewis, here's your question. Did you enjoy your flight from the UK to Canada, and what was your favourite stop-off point? I think you might have touched on that briefly, but yeah, what?
Yeah, I mean, we loved the flight over. I think we've sort of already spoken to the adventure that it was to get over there. I think that the best stop off for us was the one in Greenland, because it's not the sort of place that we would get to stop normally. And actually just being in there, although we were only overnight on the way home and a lunch stop on the way over, just such spectacular scenery with those icebergs. What really made it feel quite real is when we arrived in Halifax, actually, which, I definitely define, although we'd landed in Goose Bay, Halifax I define as our first proper stop in Canada. And the reason for that, I remember talking to a young child, I think probably no more than about 8 or 9 years old. And they were asking there were some marks on the wing of the aircraft that we were talking to. And it was rain spots, which had dried out, which you get on your car, if the rain's been falling. And they were asking what these marks were. And I said, oh, that's actually, they're rain spots. And he sort of said, well, it's not raining. So how did you get those? And actually the rain that we'd been through was across in Scotland just 48 hours earlier. And when I said that to him, I said, yeah, that's from the rain in RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland, which was just the day before yesterday. And his jaw dropped and he just couldn't believe that we'd flown this aircraft from Scotland, which is a place he knew. He obviously knew it on a map, but he knew it was a long, long, long way away. And here he was sort of touching the wing of the aircraft, which had rain spots from Scotland on it. And, that was a sort of a magical moment for me that made us realize what an adventure it was, and actually how close really, we are to one another between Canada and the UK relatively.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That was a great question, Lewis. Thank you for that. And here's one, I'm not quite sure who it's from, but so to me, this is a great question. I wouldn't even know where to begin with this. What is the difference between the tornado and corkscrew maneuver?
I'll take that one.
Yeah, I'll take that one. That's a great question, actually. That's obviously come from someone who's very knowledgeable about Red Arrows displays. So the corkscrew maneuver is a traditional maneuver that's been in the Red Arrows display for probably nigh on 30 years, where there are 2 aircraft that are inverted, and then there are 2 aircraft that are corkscrewing, hence the name, around the back of their smoke trail. In the last 4 or 5 years, that maneuver has developed into something that we now call tornado, which is just a bigger, grander version of that, where we now have 7 aircraft in formation, normal, graceful formation, very close together with one another. And then we have 2 aircraft now trying to barrel roll around those. And to add to the complexity, we bend that formation of 7 aircraft. So they're turning whilst the 2 aircraft are trying to corkscrew around the back of their smoke. So actually, in essence, they're very similar maneuvers. It's just the tornado is a much bigger maneuver than the corkscrew itself.
Okay. Can you give us a couple of names of some other maneuvers, some other names that you have?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we have the Python, which is a lovely big graceful barrel roll, which does, when you look at the smoke, look like a big sort of snaking python. We have the rollbacks, which is always a favorite, which is where there are tight little barrel rolls where the aircraft sort of roll around each other. We have the palm split, which is where a big sort of grand arena filling, sky is just full of aircraft as they peel away from one another to make the palm shape. And then clearly a crowd favourite, which is the heart and spear, which is always, a favourite.
One of our signature arrivals we can do when we get to an airfield is the spaghetti break. So 9 aircraft running in our iconic diamond formation, pulling up into a loop. And then at the top of the loop, the aircraft all split. So it looks like spaghetti being dropped into a pan. And it's something we can't do at an air show because we would have to fly over the crowd, but we can do it when we arrive at some airfields if air traffic will allow us, and if what's going on underneath is appropriate. So that's a real signature arrival of ours.
Yeah, I think I saw that one on not live, but on a video, and it is absolutely awe-inspiring. And actually, on that, Adam, what determines when you can use smoke and when you can't?
So the smoke we use for a couple of different reasons. So primarily, we're using it to help draw those shapes in the sky. Our display is about 20 minutes long in 2 halves. So the first half is the graceful 9-ship maneuvering with a couple of more dynamic maneuvers like tornado in there. And it's predominantly white smoke with some red and blue being used. And then as we move into the second half, where we have the more dynamic maneuvers, we break down into the two sections and we have the synchro pair doing their opposition passes, that's really when we use the red and blue as well to best effect. So that's how we're using the smoke for the visual effect for the crowd, but actually it's helps with the safety for us as well. So the aircraft red 6 and 7, the synchro pair, when they're coming down towards each other, they've got a closure of over 1,000 kilometers an hour, and they need to be visual with each other to make that safe separation as they cross. And one of the important things for that is the fact that they're trailing smoke. So it's much easier for red 7 to visually acquire red 6 because of that smoke trail. So it fulfills a couple of safety areas as well as that really dynamic picture. We can also use it on landing as well. Sometimes you'll notice that as red 1 lands, or whoever the first aircraft is landing, they'll put out a quick puff of smoke, and that lets the aircraft behind them in the stack as they're coming in on final approach to see which way the wind is going, because we need to avoid the turbulence that's coming off that aircraft, and that'll be drifting downwind. So wherever that smoke goes, that's the direction the turbulence is going, and we'll adjust our flight path to make sure we avoid that.
Gosh, that's really interesting. I mean, I have to admit that the sort of security aspect of the smoke is not something that had even occurred to me, and obviously there's a whole other dimension to it that's not so obvious to us. So thank you, that was really interesting. So here's a bit of a loaded question. Did you try any Canadian cuisine while you were here? And if so, what did you try?
Yes, we did, absolutely. I think from stop 1 in Halifax, we were fed donaires on an evening out, and yeah, I mean I think we had the whole gambit, didn't we? I think both.
Yeah, there's something, I can't remember the name of it, but it's I'm not even going to try and describe it. Melted cheese and a few other things on there seem to be
poutine.
That's
poutine,
the one. Yeah,
yes,
I think one of the snowbirds introduced me to that, and
we had everything from the scallops up in Halifax, across to kind of Vancouver. Yeah, we tried to sample as much of the local delicacies as we absolutely could, and including both the food and the drink.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and poutine to my mind is an absolute delicacy. It's controversial. I mean, it's rib-stickingly good in my mind. So I'm glad you at least got to have that as well. Got another question here about, the question is, what was your favourite flyover? And we've talked about some of your favourite moments, but then it goes on to say, which was actually the most difficult? So in terms of sort of the logistical complexities, which flyover was the most difficult for you to do?
I'd say because of the help we had and the early engagement we had with the right people, ultimately, all of the coordination and so on was relatively straightforward for us. I'd say the two that had the most complexity were Vancouver, that we've already mentioned, because of the amount of general aviation traffic, the seaplanes flying around, and obviously the great flexibility shown by the pilots there and the companies allowing us to use that airspace. But then also Niagara, clearly you have aircraft taking tourists to have a look at that. So really we were given free rein of that airspace for a relatively short window, but enough time for us to get 2 or 3 passes in to make sure that our photographers pre-positioned on the ground, as well as the airborne shots, we could get appropriately, because there'd be nothing worse than having a window to fly over Niagara Falls and to come back with photographs that didn't do it justice. So I'd say in my mind, those two for coordination.
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, Toronto, I mean, a wonderful place to display, but we have to remember that the display site is only about 6 miles away from Toronto Pearson Airport. It's a huge international airport. So as soon as we're out of the display site, for me as the leader of the team, making sure that we don't stray into any of the approach lanes with those big international aircraft, 747s and 777s coming into land, is really actually quite complex in itself. And I doff my cap to the Nav Canada guys and the air traffic control there, who allowed us to do this spaghetti break over the tower of over Pearson Airport, which is in all effects probably bigger than most of the international airports we have here in the UK. Was very complex in itself.
Yeah, and it makes the stops all very individual as well, doesn't it? I mean, there can be no blanket approach to each particular stop that you do, presumably.
No, none whatsoever, and that's where we really relied on, our host nation partners, the ones that we've already sort of name checked, for really giving us the great advice of how to achieve each of these tasks at each of the locations. Because without their help, we really would have been completely blind into it. And I'm sure we would have got there, but in a much slicker fashion with these friends of ours now who really did assist us in everything that we did.
Mm. Yeah, it does. So I have another question here, and just to give another shout out to everyone, do keep your questions coming in because we've still got some good time. So the question, I'm actually going to paraphrase it slightly, so apologies to whoever sent it in. The question was actually, during your North America tour, did you prefer US or Canada? But I'm going to paraphrase it slightly and not put you on the spot like that. But can you perhaps tell us about some of the highlights of the North American tour, of the American part of the tour, the US leg of it? Because I know that you did a lot of different things there, including flying over Chicago, over New York, etc. What were some of the highlights around the US part of it?
I think for us, the highlights were obviously clearly the big iconic flypasts and the locations that anyone would recognize. I think we'll probably both nod when I mention the Golden Gate Bridge, which just in itself is a statement. And flying down the Hudson as well over New York with the American display teams of the Thunderbirds and F-35s and F-22s, which as frontline fighter pilots was, again, a real pinch me moment. I think what really seamlessly highlights all of this, and I kind of already mentioned it, is just that the aviation world in itself is really quite a small world. And the highlight for us is that we were treated with just the same respect in both Canada and US as we do at home. And, those international allies and partners, it was just so seamless the way that they were able to assist us. And I think that's where the parallels between both parts of the tour, the sections in Canada and the sections in the US, were just so similar. And actually the bits that, the personal relationships between us and our professional colleagues.
And there are many similarities between the two aspects of the tour, but the great thing as well was it wasn't a US part of the tour and then a Canada part of the tour. We were in and out throughout the whole tour. So that just, the variety of it for us was amazing. And the fact that in both the US and Canada, we were able to mix the flying elements with those ground engagements in some pretty long and tiring days where we had multiple flypasts, then straight onto the ground, police escort to where the event was going on. And that was the theme throughout. So it would be unfair to ask you to pick your favorite child, and that's almost what we're being asked here. But there were differences between the two, many similarities, but the US and Canada complementing each other on the tour meant that it just was the whole rounded. It wouldn't have been the same had we just done one or the other. The fact that we were in both really made it a rounded and memorable event for us.
Absolutely. And I mean, certainly from our perspective, we also liaise very closely with our US colleagues regarding the tour as a whole. And actually, Perty, you make a very good point about sort of the relationships that exist between, like-minded organizations when you're basically doing very similar things. And as we mentioned earlier with the Snowbirds, have a very similar ethos. And I think it just speaks again to actually how what you do really does break down borders and barriers. And actually you become sort of an organization of people all working with the same aim and with the same mindset and ethos, and that must pay dividends. And actually nationality then almost doesn't come into it.
Absolutely. And actually the sort of put a cap on all of it, which was again purely by luck than judgment, our last fixture on all of the tour before we then set off on the long journey home was down in the southwest. It was down in Los Angeles at a place called Huntington Beach Air Show. And there at the air show was us, the UK's Red Arrows, the US Air Force Thunderbirds, and the Royal Canadian Snowbirds. And it just couldn't have been a more perfect sort of melting pot of the three nations coming together and being able to kind of liaise with one another, learn from each other. And we just had such a great time. And it was, again, I've sort of used the term a number of times, but it was the icing on the cake to cap off that tour.
Absolutely. We've got a great question here from Heather on Facebook about STEM. And so you mentioned STEM and how to get more children excited about science and technology. Women are traditionally underrepresented in STEM fields. How do we change that? And how can we get more female pilots in the sky? Perhaps, Adam, I can kick that one to you first.
It's a very good question. It's one that we are asked frequently. So the Red Arrows represent the Royal Air Force. Really, in terms of proportions of men and women, we pretty much mirror the rest of the Royal Air Force. We're often asked the question about why aren't there any female pilots on the team? Well, there have been previously. And the way our selection works is there's some minimum criteria that you need to have before you apply, and applying is a voluntary basis. So really, the proportion of female fighter pilots in the Royal Air Force is relatively small. And if they don't want to apply to the team, then nobody's going to go out and force them to do that. So that's why, certainly on the pilot front, our team is represented how it is. Now, on the engineers side, we have a great number of female engineers, and the Blues cover a multitude of support functions. And actually on the tour, our engineering officer, Lissy, was able to go out and speak to young people in the STEM environment. And what better ambassador than a female engineering officer who flies in the back seat with Red One to be able to say, look, I'm here, I'm the engineering officer, I've got 100 people who work for me. And by the way, I fly in the back seat of that red jet there, ensuring that the engineering and the support functions work as we're taking these 12 aircraft across North America. So actually, sometimes it's relatively easy for us to represent that. And there's certainly been instances on previous tours where we've had such great feedback from young girls that we've spoken to about, you've really inspired me to want to do this, that, and the other. There was a great story by our current officer commanding. When he was the team leader, he spoke at a function on a tour in the Middle East, thought he'd done a good job in inspiring people. And he spoke to a young girl afterwards who must have been 7 or 8. And he said to her, so has what I've been talking about inspired you to become a pilot? And she just looked at him and went, no. He's like, oh, okay. And then she looked back at him and went, I want to be an astronaut. And that's when you know that you've achieved your aim. And what's great for us is we get that feedback on the tour. So from the STEM events, both the Reds and the Blues, getting that feedback is amazing to hear. Mm.
Absolutely, and I mean certainly from the STEM engagements that we did here, we had really good groupings of young boys and girls and that, and to see just the excitement in their eyes is just incredible. And again, I do have to give a shout out to Lissy. I met her and was in a couple of events with her, and she is an outstanding ambassador for what she does. So do say hi to her from all of us here.
Of course.
So I think we've got time for just 1 or 2 more questions. This one goes back to your impressions of Canada, and again, picking the favourite child. Which of the Canadian cities that you visited would you like to come back to explore in more depth? Or in fact, actually, let me throw that question out further. Has it sort of like raised any other sort of areas of Canada in your mindset that you think you'd like to come back and just see, even as a tourist?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we'd probably pick all 4 of them. The area that I think most of us had been to the least, or least well represented amongst those who've been places before, was Vancouver, and just all of that west coast. BC in itself is, I mean, it's infamous. It's famous. It's the place that we would love to have spent a little bit more time, and getting up there into the hills. And most of us, because of our job, take our physical fitness very importantly, and we love getting out in the hills, skiing, all of that Vancouver and BC has to offer. I think we'd love to come back and spend much more time when we're not on the job itself. I mean, it was just full of surprises. I'd been lucky in that I'd been to Halifax before, and I knew it was such a hidden gem, and yet a number of the guys had they just didn't know what to expect of Halifax, and we had such a good time in Halifax, and it's just such a great Nova Scotian welcome from the people there. And that was the start of the tour. And I think a lot of people had their eyes opened to, they thought they were in the middle of nowhere, and yet they had all this on hand to explore. So we can't pick one. I think BC is probably the area, the western side of Canada is probably the area that most guys and girls would love to come back to and explore in a lot more detail.
I think for me, having really been from Goose Bay all the way across to Vancouver, which I think I'm right in saying is the furthest west we've ever taken a red jet, irrespective of country. And the variety and the changes you see across the country, and just that differing landscapes, differing terrain, differing weather even in that short period that we were over there. And then on the way home, as Perty mentioned, the weather going across to Narsarsuaq in Greenland wasn't good enough. So we ended up coming back to Goose Bay and then pushing further north. So we actually ended up going up to Iqaluit and then seeing a whole new landscape up there, and almost whole new culture that really was completely different from anything we'd seen elsewhere. So for me, just the whole variety across the country is what stood out, and that was the major point for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm glad to see BC ranks highly in your places to revisit, and let me know if you need any recommendations of where to go.
Absolutely.
Skiing in Whistler is a definite for most people. So perhaps just a quick question from me, actually looking forward a little bit as well. I mean, we've mentioned obviously that this has been an incredibly complex year for on many levels. You know, hoping that we are able to move on in the near future. What would the next sort of year, 2 years look like for you? If you know, in an ideal world, what would you be sort of thinking about now at this stage?
So the way our cycle works, if you like, is we will fly our domestic season in the UK, normally from the end of May through to late September, early October. For the tour to North America, we actually cut that domestic season short, and we left the UK roughly halfway through our normal season to make sure that we caught the big shows and the events going on in the US and Canada. So normally we would do probably 2 overseas tours in every 3 years. And that's really dictated by the government and where they want us to go and fly the flag. So we would run a domestic season where essentially it's a reset period. We might then fly a major tour, such as the North American one at the end of the season. And the following year, we might do a smaller tour. But that's not completely set in stone. So the great thing about this job, as I just mentioned about Canada, is the variety. So for us, as we're going through the domestic season, we're really representing the Royal Air Force, representing the military. And then when we get to the end of that domestic season, we're now a national asset that the government is going to use to fly the flag around the world. And depending on what's going on in the world and where the government wants us to have influence, that's where we'll start focusing. So can't really go into any details at the moment. What you can be sure of is that the Red Arrows will be touring various parts of the world fairly regularly to keep flying the red, white and blue across the sky wherever we go.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, when I move on to future postings, I would happily work with you again, happily work with you on another tour. So fingers crossed we can make that happen at some point. Martin, Adam, it's been great to reconnect with you. It's such a pleasure. And once again, thank you for everything you did for us last year, and also for making the time today to speak to us and just kind of enable us to relive some of those memories. I'd just like to round out with just a final question. So it's been really great to sort of think back and you know, just hear your impressions. What was the impression that you were left with from Canada? What was the kind of like the one takeaway thing after you finished up your time here?
I think my takeaway was that it's really not very far away. And I don't mean that in literal terms. I don't mean in geographical terms. I just mean, you know, we had so much in common with so many people over there, and just that slightly unexpected nature of us not knowing what to expect when we arrived, and very quickly finding that we were amongst friends, we were amongst a family, is really what I'm left with as the impression of my time in Canada last year.
I think what was obvious from the start in Gatineau, through all the places we went, is the warm welcome that we received and how pleased people were to see us there, which you start off on these tours and you don't quite know what to expect, as Perty mentioned, but without fail, we received a warm welcome. The people we worked with, the event organisers, the air bosses, the members of the Canadian military. I think we've all formed friendships and bonds that will last a very long time, and that was obvious right from the start. So that's my takeaway from it.
Well, thank you both so much. That's a great way to end this. As I say, thanks again for everything you did. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in today, and for all of our contacts and friends and partners who are online. Thanks so much for making this happen. And also, I do want to conclude by thanking our sponsor for today, Marshall Aerospace and Defence Group as well. So thank you both. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. All the very, very best for the forthcoming future. And yeah, hopefully our paths will cross again at some point.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Great. Nice to see you too. Take care. Bye-bye.